Hi class, last lesson of chapter 13, lesson 4, linear equations in slope-intercept form. So this is a new form, a new equation that we're going to learn and work with. Let's touch on some vocab and key ideas. The x-intercept of a line is the x-coordinate of the point where the line crosses over the x-axis. So we're looking at where does the line cross, at what x value does the line cross the x-axis? And that is when y is going to equal 0. So that's our x-intercept. Think intercept, it's like when it intersects with the x-axis. Now the y-intercept is basically the opposite. It's where it crosses the y-axis. And it occurs when x equals 0. A linear equation written in the form y equals mx plus b is in slope-intercept form. So this is our slope-intercept form. The slope of the line is m and the y-intercept is b. So that's important to know. M is still our slope. Okay, we had y equals mx form before, but now we're adding the b in there, the plus b, and the b is our y-intercept. So it's where our line crosses over the y-axis. When x is 0, what is y? That's what we would have to figure out, or that's what that would tell us. So this is an important equation. We might want to write that down, make note of it. That's what we're going to be working with this lesson. So first, let's do example 1. We're just identifying the slope and the y-intercept from these equations. So part A, y equals negative 4x minus 2. So this is in y equals mx plus b form. It's in our slope-intercept form, right? Y equals. Now we're looking at what is m, what's our slope, and what is b, what's our y-intercept. So we're finding both of those, the slope and the y-intercept. So we're just looking at what replaced the m and the b in this equation. So this is our m, this is our b. Now careful, you always take the sign with it. So notice how in the equation, y equals mx plus b, it's normally positive. Well, since this says minus 2, it's going to be a negative 2. So we're going to say our slope, or m, equals negative 4. Keep the sign, and our y-intercept, or b, equals negative 2. That's it, we're done. Next, part B, y minus 5 equals 3/2 x. Now notice, this is not in y equals mx plus b form yet, because the y is not alone. It's not in y equals form. So we have to get y by itself first, so you might have to move some things around, and then you can identify your slope and your y-intercept. So to get y by itself, I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So now I have y equals 3/2 x plus 5. Now this is in y equals mx plus b form. We have our m, which is 3/2, and we have our b, which is 5. Since it's plus 5, those are going to be positive values. So we're going to just write m equals 3/2. That's our slope. And our y-intercept is 5. So now we're done. That's it. Let's move down to example 2. We're going to graph a linear equation that's in slope-intercept form. So they want us to graph y equals negative 3x plus 3. They want us to identify the x-intercept. So step 1, whenever we're given it in slope-intercept form to graph it, first we want to find the slope, and then we want to find the y-intercept. Those are the two things that are going to help us to graph this equation. So first, just down here, I'm going to rewrite it. Y equals negative 3x plus 3. So negative 3 is our slope, and positive 3 is our y-intercept. If we remember our y-intercept, let me just zoom out a little. Our y-intercept, I'm looking at this second bullet point, is where our line is going to cross over the y-axis, but it occurs when x equals 0. So when x is 0, they're telling us that that 3 is y. So our y-intercept is going to be 0, 3. That's a point on our line. So that's a point that I can plot on my graph. So see how step 2 says plot the y-intercept? That's what we're going to do. Our y-intercept is 0, 3. It's going to cross over the y-axis at 3. So there's my point 0, 3. Now we're going to use the slope to find another point on this line, and then we're going to be able to connect those 2 points. So our slope is -3, which means if I want to write this as rise over run in slope form, I would write this as -3 over 1. Remember, a whole number is always over 1. I can always write it as a fraction. So what this is telling me is that I'm rising -3, which means I'm going to go down 3, and then I'm running 1, which means I'm going to move to the right 1. So what that tells me is from that point I plotted, from my y-intercept, I'm going to do my slope. I'm going to go down 3, and then I'm going to go to the right 1, and that's going to give me my new or another point on this graph. Those are 2 points. We can connect those and create our line. If you wanted to, from this point we just created, you could do your slope again. Go down 3 more over 1. These are creating all points that should be on this line. So if you wanted more than just 2 points to connect, you could do a third if it fits. But basically, once you have those 2 points, you're just connecting them to create your line. So now we just graphed that equation. So that's it, we're done. Let's look at example 3 here. Real life application. The cost y in dollars of taking a taxi x miles is y equals 2.5x plus 2. We want to graph this equation. So again, to graph it, when we have it in y equals mx plus b form, let's identify what our slope and our y-intercept are. So my slope is 2.5, and my y-intercept is 2, which means I'll have the point 0, 2 on my graph. You always want to start with your y-intercept. You can always, x is always going to be 0, that's why I put a 0 here, and then whatever your y-intercept, that's your y value. So now we're just going to plot that point. So I'm going to go to 0, 2 and place a point. So that's my first point. Now I'm going to use my slope to find another point so that I can draw a line for this equation. So my slope is 2.5, which means, you can do this one of 2 ways. You could keep it as 2.5 and you could rise 2.5 and just go over 1 if you wanted to kind of keep it as a fraction. That's fine. It's a little harder when you have decimals though. A half is easy, but if it was like 0.3 or 0.6, that's a lot harder. So another way, I would just want to show you another way to do this is that I could write 2.5 as a mixed number. I could then change that to an improper fraction. So my slope is really 5 over 2, which means I rise 5 and then go to the right 2, my rise over run. So from this point that I have plotted from my y-intercept, I'm going to rise 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'm going to run 2, positive, so I'm going to move to the right 2. And then I'm going to plot my point, if I could plot it. So that is a way to do it. Now, if you wanted to keep it as 2.5, that's fine. From that point, you could go up 2 full, stay halfway, and go over 1. You would just be in the middle of the grid, which is fine because a half is kind of easy to mark out. But if you wanted to be more precise, I would make it improper and use that as your rise over run. But again, you just need at least 2 points to be able to connect to create your graph. So now we graph the equation. Let's look at what part B is asking us. It wants us to interpret the y-intercept and the slope. Remember, interpret means to explain what do they mean in this problem. So our y-intercept is 2, which is at 0.02. Let's interpret that point. What does it mean for this problem? Well, our y value represents the cost in dollars for the taxi, and the x represents the miles. So if I drive 0 miles, my cost is automatically going to be $2. So my y-intercept is telling me that no matter how many miles you drive, you automatically still have to pay $2. So no miles driven, 0 miles driven. So 0 miles costs $2. So as soon as you get into that taxi, you automatically have a fee of $2 just for maybe just wasting their time. So it's automatically $2 when you get in there. Now let's interpret the slope. The slope is 2.5. Now it's 2.5 times x, which means that every mile that you drive, it costs $2.50. So it's $2.50 per mile that this taxi drives you. So $2.50 per mile, maybe you want to say driven. But that's interpreting our y-intercept and our slope. That's what we just did there. Interpret, remember, means to explain, which is what we just did. All right, guys, that is it for chapter 13. That was